Chapter 8, Two Narrow Escapes. Okay, sounds like an active chapter. Everyone was cheerful as the Dawn Treader sailed from Dragon Island. They had fair wind as soon as they were out of the bay, and they came early next morning to the unknown land which some of them had seen when flying over the mountains while Eustace was still a dragon. It was a low green island, inhabited by nothing but rabbits and a few goats, but from the ruins of some stone huts they found in blackened places where fire had been, they judged that it had been peopled not long before. There were also some bones and broken weapons around. "Pirates' work," said Caspian. "Or the dragons," said Edmund. The only other thing they found here was a little skin boat or coracle on the sands. It was made of a hide stretched over a wicker framework. It was a tiny boat, 4 feet long. That's not very long. And the paddle, which was still in it, was in proportion to the size of the boat. So they thought it either had been made for a child or else maybe the people of that country had been dwarfs. Reepicheep decided to keep it as it was just the right size for him, so it was taken on board the ship. They called that land Burnt Island, and they sailed away before noon. For some 5 days, they ran before a south-southeast wind, out of sight of all lands and seeing neither fish nor gull. Then they had a day that rained hard until the afternoon. Eustace lost 2 games of chess to Reepicheep, and he started to get to be rather like his old, grumpy and disagreeable self again. And then Edmund said he wished they all could have gone to America with Susan, and then Lucy looked out of the stern windows and said, "Hello, I do believe it's stopping, and what is that?" They all tumbled out onto the poop deck at this and found that the rain had stopped, and that Drinian, who was on watch, was also staring hard at something astern, something at the back of them. Or rather, at several things. They looked like little smooth, rounded rocks, a whole line of them with intervals of about 40 feet in between each rounded rock. "But they can't be rocks," Drinian was saying, "because they weren't there 5 minutes ago when we sailed through there." "Oh, look, one just disappeared," said Lucy. "Yes, and there's another one coming up," said Edmund. "And it's nearer to us," said Euston. "Hang it," said Caspian, "the whole thing is moving this way." "And moving a great deal quicker than we can sail, sire," said Drinian. "It'll be caught up with us in a minute." They all held their breath, for it is not at all nice to be pursued by an unknown something either on land or sea. But what it turned out to be was far worse than anyone had suspected. Suddenly, only about the length of a cricket pitch from their port side, an appalling head reared itself out of the sea. It was all greens and vermilions with purple blotches, except where shellfish clung to it, and it was shaped rather like a horse's head, though without ears. It had enormous eyes, like eyes made for staring through the dark depths of the ocean, and a gaping mouth filled with double rows of sharp fish-like teeth. It came up on what they first took to be a huge neck, but as more and more of it emerged as it came further and further out of the water, everyone knew that this was not its neck. Its whole body was like that, and that at last they were seeing what so many people have foolishly wanted to see: the great sea serpent. The folds at its gigantic tail could be seen far away, rising at intervals from the surface, and now its head was towering up higher than the mast. So in the water, part of it would be underwater, then some would come out of the water, then underwater, then out of the water. So that's what looked like the rocks or the things poking up out of the water every few feet, every 40 feet. Every man rushed to his weapons, but there was nothing to be done. The monster was out of reach of swords, for sure. "Shoot! Shoot!" cried the master bowman, and several of them obeyed, but the arrows just bounced off the sea serpent's hide as if it was iron-plated. Then for a dreadful minute everyone was still, staring up at its eyes and mouth, and wondering where it was going to pounce on them. But it didn't pounce. It shot its head forward, across the ship, on a level with the yard of the mast. Now its head was just beside the fighting top. Still it stretched and stretched till its head went over top of the starboard bulwark, and then down it began to come, not on the crowded deck, but back into the water, and the ship is in between here. So that the whole ship was under one of the arches of the serpent. And almost at once that arch began to get smaller. Indeed, on the starboard side, the sea serpent was now almost touching the Dawn Treader's side. Eustace, who had been really trying very hard to behave well till the rain in the chest put him back, now did the first brave thing he'd ever done. He was wearing a sword that Caspian had lent him. As soon as the serpent's body was near enough on the starboard side of the ship, he jumped up on the bulwark and began hacking at it with all his might. Now, it is true that he actually accomplished nothing beyond breaking Caspian's second-best sword to bits, but it was a fine thing for a beginner to have done. Others would have joined him if at that moment Reepicheep had not called out, "Don't fight, push!" Well, as you know about Reepicheep, it was so unusual for the mouse to advise anyone not to fight that even in that terrible moment, every eye looked at him, and when he jumped up on the bulwark forward of the snake and set his little furry back against its huge, scaly, slimy back and began pushing just as hard as he could, quite a number of people saw what he meant to do and rushed to both sides of the ship to do the same thing. So they're trying to push against the serpent to force the boat forward, right? The brute had made a loop of itself around the Dawn Treader and was beginning to draw the loop tight. And when it got quite tight, he would just snap it, and there'd be floating matchwood where the ship had been, and he could just pick them all out of the water as one by one. So their only chance was to push the loop backwards until it slid over the stern, or better put, is pushing the ship forward, right? Reepicheep alone had, of course, no more chance of doing this than of lifting up a church, but he had nearly killed himself with trying before others shoved him aside and took over. Very soon the whole ship's company, except Lucy and the mouse, was in two long lines along the two bulwarks. Each man's chest was to the back of the man in front, so that the weight of the whole line was in the last man, pushing for their lives. For a few sickening seconds, which seemed like hours, I have to say, nothing seemed to be happening. Joints cracked, sweat dropped, breath came in grunts and gasps as they pushed as hard as they could. Then they felt like the ship was moving, so they kept pushing as hard as they could. Then they saw that the snake loop was further back of the ship than it had been, but they also saw that it was getting smaller. It was closing in on the ship, and now the real danger was at hand. Could they get it over the poop deck, or was it already too tight? Oh, look, yes, keep pushing, it'll just fit. And it was resting on the poop rails. A dozen or more sprang up on the deck, which was far better place to push. The sea serpent's body was now so low that they could just make up a line all across the loop and push side by side. Hope began to raise high until everyone remembered the high carved stern, the dragon tail of the Dawn Treader at the very back of the boat. Well, they knew it would be quite impossible to get the brute over that. "An axe!" cried Caspian hoarsely, and "Still push!" Lucy, who knew where everything was, heard him where she was standing on the main deck, staring up at the deck. In a few seconds she jumped below, got the axe, and was rushing up the ladder to the poop deck. But just as she reached the top, there came a great crashing noise like a tree coming down, and the ship rocked and bounced and darted forward. For at that very moment, whether because the sea serpent was being pushed so hard or because it had foolishly decided to draw the noose tight, the whole of the carved stern broke off. But the ship was free. The others were simply too exhausted to see what Lucy saw. There, a few yards behind them, the loop of the serpent's body got rapidly smaller and smaller and disappeared in a splash. Lucy always said, but of course she was very excited at the moment, and it may have been only her imagination, but she said that she saw a look of idiotic satisfaction on the creature's face. What is certain is that it was a very stupid animal, for instead of pursuing the fish, it turned its head around and began nosing all along its own body as if it expected to find the wreckage of the Dawn Treader there. But the Dawn Treader was already well away, running before a fresh breeze, and the men lay and sat around, panting and groaning all about the deck, till presently they were able to talk about it and eventually to laugh about it. And when some rum had been served out, they even raised a cheer, and everyone praised the bravery of Eustace, though it hadn't done any good, and of Reep-a-Cheep. After this they sailed for 3 more days, and they saw nothing but sea and sky. On the 4th day the wind changed to the north, and the seas began to rise, like the waves getting bigger. By the afternoon it had nearly become a gale. That's a very strong wind. But at the same time they sighted land on their port bow. Who remembers which side port is? There's 4 letters in the word port, and there's 4 letters in the word left, so it's on the left side of the boat, on the port bow. The bow is the front of the ship. By your leave, sire, said Drinian, we will try to get under the lee of that country by rowing and lie in harbor, maybe till this is over. Caspian agreed, but a long row against the gale did not bring them to the land before evening. By the last light of that day they steered into a natural harbor and anchored, but no one went ashore that night. In the morning they found themselves in the green bay of a rugged, lonely-looking country which sloped up to a rocky summit. From the windy north beyond that summit clouds came streaming rapidly. They lowered the boat and loaded her with any of the water casks which were now empty. Which streams shall we water at, Drinian? Said Caspian as he took his seat in the stern sheets of the boat. There seemed to be 2 of them coming down into the bay. Makes little difference, sire, said Drinian, but I think it's a shorter pull to that one on the starboard, the eastern one. Uh-oh, here comes the rain, said Lucy. I should think it does, said Edmund, for it was already pelting them hard. I say, let's go to the other stream. There are trees there, and we'll have some shelter. Yes, let's, said Eustace. No point in getting wetter than we need to. But all the time Drinian was steadily steering to the starboard one, like tiresome people in cars who continue at 40 miles an hour while you are explaining to them that they are on the wrong road. They're right, Drinian, said Caspian. Why don't you bring her head around and make for the western stream? Okay, as your majesty pleases, said Drinian a little shortly. He'd had an anxious day with the weather yesterday, and he didn't like advice from landsmen, but he altered course, and it turned out afterwards that it was a good thing he did. By the time they had finished watering, the rain was over, and Caspian, with Eustace, the Pevensies, and Reep-a-Cheep decided to walk up to the top of the hill and see what they could see. It was a stiff climb through coarse grass and heather, and they saw neither man nor beast except seagulls. When they reached the top of the hill, they saw that it was a very small island, not more than, say, 20 acres, and from this height the sea looked larger and more desolate than it did from the deck or even the fighting top of the Dawn Treader. Crazy, you know, said Eustace to Lucy in a low voice, looking at the eastern horizon. Sailing on and on into that, with no idea of what we might get into. But he only said it out of habit, and not really nastily as he would have done at one time. It was too cold to stay very long on the ridge, for the wind still blew freshly from the north. Don't let's go back the same way, said Lucy as they turned. Let's go along a bit and come down by the other stream, the one Drinian wanted to go to. Everyone agreed to this, and after about 15 minutes they were at the source of the second river. It was a more interesting place than they had expected, a deep little mountain lake surrounded by cliffs except for a narrow channel on the seaward side out of which the water flowed. Here at last they were out of the wind, and all of them sat down in the heather above the cliff for a rest. Well, all of them sat down but one, Edmund, who jumped up again very quickly. They go in for sharp stones on this island, he said, groping around in the heather to find the sharp stone that he'd sat on. Where is that wretched thing? Oh, now I've got it. Hello, it wasn't a stone at all. It's the hilt of a sword. No, by George, it's a whole sword. It's the sword that the rust has left of it. Well, what's left after it's been rusted is what he was trying to say. It must have lain here for ages. That sword looks Narnian, said Caspian as they all crowded around it. I'm sitting on something too, said Lucy, something hard. It turned out to be the remains of a mail shirt, the armored shirt that the knights wear. By this time, everyone was on their hands and knees, feeling in the thick heather in every direction. Their search revealed, one by one, a helmet, a dagger, a few coins, not Calorman crescents, but genuine Narnian lions, and trees, such as you might see any day in the marketplace at Beaversdam or Baruna. Looks as if this might be all that's left of one of our 7 lords, said Edmund. It's exactly what I was thinking, said Caspian. I wonder which one it was. There's nothing on the dagger to show who owned it. And I wonder how he died. And how are we to avenge him, added Reepicheep. Edmund, the only one of the party who had read several detective stories, had meanwhile been thinking. Look here, he said, there's something very fishy about this. He can't have been killed in a fight. Why not, said Caspian. Well, there's no bones, said Edmund. An enemy might take the armor and leave the body, but who ever heard of a chap who'd won a fight carrying away the body and leaving the armor? Maybe he was killed by a wild animal, Lucy suggested. Well, it'd be a clever animal, said Edmund, that could take off a man's mail shirt and eat him. Maybe a dragon, said Caspian. Nothing doing, said Eustace. A dragon couldn't do it. I ought to know. Well, let's get away from the place anyway, said Lucy. She had not felt like sitting down again since Edmund had raised the question of bones. Okay, if you like, said Caspian, getting up. I don't think any of this stuff is worth taking away. They came down and round to the little opening where the stream came out of the lake and stood looking at the deep water within the circle of cliffs. It had been a hot day. No doubt some would have been tempted to jump in the water, and everyone would have had a drink. Indeed, even as it was, Eustace was on the very point of stooping down and scooping up some water in his hands, when Reepicheep and Lucy both at the same moment cried, Look! So he forgot about his drink, and he looked into the water. The bottom of the pool was made of large, grayish-blue stones, and the water was perfectly clear. And on the bottom lay a life-size figure of a man, made, apparently, of gold. It lay face downward with its arms stretched out above its head. And it so happened that as they looked at it, the clouds parted and the sun shone out. The golden shape at the bottom of the lake was lit up from end to end as it reflected the light of the sun. And Lucy thought it was the most beautiful statue she'd ever seen. Well, whistled Caspian, that was worth coming to see. I wonder, can we get it out of there? We can dive for it, sire, said Reepicheep. No good at all, said Edmund. At least, if it's really gold, solid gold, it'll be far too heavy to bring up, and that pool is 12 or 15 feet deep if it's an inch. Half a moment, though. It's a good thing I brought a hunting spear with me. Let's see what the depth is like. Hold on to my hand, Caspian, while I lean out over the water a bit. Caspian took his hand, and Edmund, leaning forward, began to lower his spear into the water. Before it was halfway in, Lucy said, I don't believe the statue is gold at all. It's only the light, because look at your spear. It's just the same color. What's wrong? Asked several voices at once, for Edmund had suddenly let go of the spear. I couldn't hold it, gasped Edmund. It was getting too heavy to hang on to. And there it is on the bottom now, said Caspian, and Lucy is right. It's just the same color as the statue. But Edmund, who appeared to be having some trouble with his boots, at least he was bending down and looking at them, straightened himself all at once and shouted out in a sharp voice which people hardly ever disobey, Go back, get away from the water, all of you, at once. Well, they all did. They jumped back and then stared at him like he was crazy. Look, said Edmund, look at the toes of my boots. They look a bit yellow, began Eustace. They're gold, solid gold, interrupted Edmund. Look at them, feel them. The leather's pulled away from it already. They're as heavy as lead. And if you know anything about gold, gold is very heavy. By Aslan, said Caspian. You don't mean to say, yes, I do, said Edmund. That water turns things into gold. It turned the spear into gold. That's why it got so heavy. And it was just lapping against my feet. It's a good thing I wasn't barefoot, and it turned the toe caps of my boots into gold. And that poor fellow on the bottom, well, you see what happened to him. So that isn't a statue at all, said Lucy in a low voice. No, the whole thing is clear now. He was here on a hot day. He undressed on the top of the cliff where we were sitting. The clothes have rotted away or been taken by the birds to line their nests with. The armor's still here. Then he dove in and, don't, said Lucy. Don't even say it. What a horrible thing. Well, and what a narrow shave we've had, said Edmund. Narrow indeed, said Reepicheep. Anyone's finger, anyone's foot, anyone's whisker, or anyone's tail might have slipped into the water at any moment. All the same, said Caspian, we may as well test it. He stooped down and pulled up a spray of heather. Then very cautiously he knelt beside the stream and dipped it in. It was heather that he dipped. What he drew out was a perfect model of heather made of purest gold, heavy and soft as lead. Well, the king who owned this island, said Caspian slowly, and his face flushed as he spoke, would soon be the richest of all kings of the world. I claim this land forever as a Narnian possession. It shall be called Goldwater Island. And I bind all of you to secret. No secrecy. No one must know of this, not even Drinian, on pain of death. Do you hear me? Who are you talking to, said Edmund. I'm no subject of yours. If anything, it's the other way around. I am one of the 4 ancient sovereigns of Narnia, and you are under allegiance to the High King, my brother. So it has come to that, King Edmund, has it? Said Caspian, laying his hand on his sword hilt. Oh, stop it, both of you, said Lucy. That's the worst of doing anything with boys. You're all such swaggering, bullying idiots. Ah! Her voice died away into a gasp, and everyone else saw what she had seen. Across the hillside above them, gray, for the heather was not yet in bloom, without noise and without looking at them, and shining as if he were in bright sunlight, though the sun had in fact gone in, passed with slow pace the hugest lion that human eyes have ever seen. In describing the scene, Lucy said afterwards, he was the size of an elephant. Though at another time she only said the size of a cart horse, but it was not the size that mattered. Nobody dared to ask what it was. They knew it was Aslan. And nobody ever saw how or where he went. They looked at one another like people waking from a sleep. What are we talking about? Said Caspian. Have I been making rather an ass of myself? Sire, said Reepicheep, this is a place with a curse on it. Let us get back on board at once. And if I might have the honor of naming this island, renaming it, I shall call it Deathwater. Well, that actually strikes me as a very good name, Reep, said Caspian, though now I come to think of it, I don't know why, but the weather seems to be settling, and I dare say Drinian would like to be off. What a lot we shall have to tell him. But in fact, they had not much to tell him, for the memory of the last hour had all become confused. Their Majesties all seemed a bit bewitched when they came aboard, said Drinian to Rince some hours later, when the Dawn Treader was once more under sail and Deathwater Island was already below the horizon. Something happened to them in that place. The only thing I could get clear was that they think they've found the body of one of these lords we're looking for. You don't say, Captain, answered Rince. Well, that's 3, only 4 more to find. At this rate, we might be home soon after the New Year. And a good thing, too. My tobacco's running a bit low. Good night, sir. And that's the end of the 2 narrow escapes. Chapter 9, The Island of the Voices. So come back and hear that, will you?